This one is going to be different from other episodes, not because the topic is taboo, though for some people it still is, but because the research is genuinely more complicated than most coverage suggests. There are people who believe pornography is categorically harmful and destroying a generation of men, and there are people who believe it's completely benign and the concern is overblown. The evidence sits somewhere more nuanced than either of those positions, and that nuance is actually useful, if you're willing to follow it. The Better Man podcast is produced by Kegel Men for informational and educational purposes only. This is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Every episode is reviewed by our medical team, but individual results may vary. Welcome back to the Better Man podcast. I'm Alex. Today we're talking about pornography, specifically what the research actually says about its effects on sexual arousal, desire, and function. We're going to look at what's well established, what's contested, and what questions remain genuinely open. This isn't a moral argument in either direction. It's an honest look at the science. Let's start with the scale of the issue, because context matters here. Pornography consumption among men is extraordinarily widespread. Studies consistently show that the majority of adult men report viewing pornography regularly, and most begin exposure during adolescence. The content available today, particularly through free streaming platforms, is fundamentally different in volume, variety, and intensity from what was accessible 20 or 30 years ago. That shift is relevant to any honest assessment of the research, because much of the older science was conducted in a very different media environment. With that context in place, let's look at what the research actually shows. The most clinically significant concern raised in the research is the association between heavy pornography use and what some researchers call pornography-induced erectile dysfunction, often abbreviated as PIED. The concept emerged prominently in the early 2000s, largely through case reports and clinician observations rather than controlled research. Men, often young, otherwise healthy, were presenting with erectile difficulties, specifically with partners, while remaining fully functional during solo use with pornography. The pattern was distinct from typical vascular or hormonal erectile dysfunction, which tends to affect all sexual situations. A 2014 review published in the journal Behavioral Sciences proposed a neurological explanation centered on dopamine. The argument ran as follows: pornography provides a supernormal stimulus, a level and variety of sexual novelty that the brain's reward system was not calibrated to encounter in the ancestral environment. Repeated exposure to this supernormal stimulus can, in theory, desensitize dopamine receptors over time, raising the threshold for what the brain finds arousing. The result is a brain that responds readily to the high-stimulation environment of pornography, but struggles to generate sufficient arousal from the comparatively lower stimulation environment of real-world intimacy. This desensitization model is biologically plausible. It mirrors the neurological changes observed in substance addiction, where repeated exposure to a powerful reward causes tolerance, diminishing response to the same stimulus over time. And several neuroimaging studies have found changes in reward circuitry activation in men who report compulsive pornography use, patterns that do resemble those seen in other addiction models. However, and this is important, the research here is correlational, not causal. We know that men who report compulsive pornography use show certain brain patterns. We do not know definitively whether pornography caused those patterns or whether men with those pre-existing brain characteristics are more likely to engage in compulsive use. That distinction matters, and the honest answer is that the science hasn't resolved it yet. There's a second body of research that complicates the picture further, and it's worth taking seriously. Several large-scale studies have failed to find a clear association between pornography use and erectile dysfunction in the general population. A 2022 study, published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, examining over 800 men, found no significant relationship between pornography consumption frequency and erectile function scores. A review published in Sexual Medicine Reviews concluded that the evidence for pornography-induced erectile dysfunction is limited by methodological weaknesses, small samples, self-selected participants, lack of control groups, and heavy reliance on self-report. This doesn't mean PIED doesn't exist. Clinical reports from sex therapists and urologists are consistent enough to suggest it does occur in some men, but it may be significantly less common than popular coverage suggests, and it may be specific to a subset of users, those with very high-frequency use, those who began early in adolescence, or those with pre-existing vulnerabilities in their reward circuitry. What the research does more consistently support is a psychological mechanism. Men who believe pornography is harmful, regardless of how much they actually consume, show higher rates of sexual dissatisfaction and more distress around their sexual function. This is sometimes called the moral incongruence model. The problem in these cases is not neurological. It's the conflict between behavior and belief, and the anxiety, shame, and self-monitoring that conflict produces. That psychological interference, as we covered in the arousal episode, is exactly the kind of input that the prefrontal cortex uses to suppress the sexual response. In other words, the distress associated with pornography use may cause more functional problems than the pornography itself. There's a separate question worth addressing: the effect of pornography on sexual expectations and relationship satisfaction. This area of the research is somewhat more consistent. Studies have found associations between heavy pornography use and reduced satisfaction with partners' physical appearance, reduced relationship quality, and, particularly in younger men, distorted expectations about sexual performance, body standards, and what sex typically looks or feels like. These effects are not universal and appear to be dose-dependent. Occasional use in an otherwise healthy relationship context shows minimal association with these outcomes. Heavy, frequent use, particularly of content featuring extreme or atypical scenarios, shows stronger associations with expectation distortion and reduced partner satisfaction. It's also worth noting that relationship context matters significantly. Men in committed relationships show different patterns of association than single men, and relationship quality itself moderates many of these effects. Pornography use, in the context of a high-quality, communicative relationship, appears to carry less risk than use, accompanied by secrecy, shame, or as a substitute for intimacy. So what does this mean practically? What should a man actually take from this? First, if you're experiencing erectile difficulties specifically with partners but not during solo use, it's worth considering whether pornography use patterns could be a contributing factor. This isn't a certain cause, but it's a clinically recognized possibility that's worth reflecting on honestly. Reducing use, particularly of high-novelty, high-intensity content, and allowing time for the nervous system and reward circuitry to recalibrate is a low-risk, evidence-informed approach worth trying. Second, if your main source of distress is a conflict between your pornography use and your values, rather than a clear, functional problem, the more productive intervention may be addressing that psychological conflict directly, rather than assuming neurological damage. Working with a therapist who specializes in sexual health can be genuinely helpful here. Third, if you use pornography occasionally and have no functional concerns, relationship difficulties, or persistent distress around it, the evidence does not support significant alarm. The research doesn't show that moderate, non-compulsive pornography use causes measurable harm in most men. And fourth, regardless of where you sit on this, The factors we've covered throughout this series are protective. Good sleep, cardiovascular health, well-managed stress, a healthy diet, and a trained pelvic floor all support the neurological and vascular resilience that makes a robust sexual response possible. These aren't alternatives to addressing pornography-related concerns. They're the foundation that makes recovery, if it's needed, more effective. If there's one thing to take from this episode, it's this. The research on pornography and sexual health is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But it's more complicated than either side of the debate usually admits. The most important thing is honest self-assessment, not judgment, assessment. Does your consumption pattern serve your sexual health and your relationships, or does it undermine them? That's a question only you can answer. But now you have better information to answer it with. That's the end of this series of The Better Man podcast. If these episodes have been useful, the best thing you can do is keep applying what you've learned and keep paying attention to what your body is telling you. The Kegel Men app is there to support the physical side of that work, with structured training and educational content built around the same evidence-based approach you've heard throughout this series. I'm Alex. This is the Better Man podcast. Thank you for listening.